Yeah. Okay. So realised I hadn't muted myself, so there was audio coming out. Great. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. As I'm sure you're aware, this is the second event with Sarah Lowndes, who will be joining us to talk about Agnes Martin and the New Mexico desert. Some of you will have tuned in last time in June, when we had Sarah Lowndes, who joined and spoke about Derek Jarman. Sarah Lowndes is a writer, curator and lecturer, a research fellow at NUA, Norwich University of the Arts. She contributes to the Sainsbury Centre public programme and works with the education team at Time and Tide Museum in Great Yarmouth. Also in Norfolk area, Sarah established Consul Cromer in 2017 to enhance the cultural provisions available in Cromer. And since then, she's hosted visual arts, music, literature, cinema and performance events. She's recently also been editing, or co-editing, a publication with Nell Cruz at Sainsbury Centre of Visual Arts called Sight Writing. And they've been working with local writers to create an alternate catalogue to the Robert and Lisa Sainsbury collection. You can get that now, it's a lovely little book. And also the Fieldwork publication, that's the thing to mention, with new nature writing from East Anglia that came out recently. An anthology with writing from 40 local authors, selected from submissions. I'm just going to post a link to that in the chat now, so you can see. I'm going to pass over to Sarah now to start, and I'll be back at the end to tell you about 3 upcoming events that we have for August and September. We've confirmed a bit further in advance now. Anyone on the mailing list will know. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll speak to you in about 70 minutes, I think. There's a presentation of slides we'll be going through, and so I'll be reading. Okay, great.
Hello, everybody.
Sorry. Let's stop your video, not mine. Okay, try again. Yeah, there we go.
Here I am. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here with you all. Thank you very much, Henry, for inviting me to speak again, and thank you to the Assembly House in Norwich for making it possible for me to share my research in this way. So as Henry's mentioned, the focus of this talk will be minimalist painter Agnes Martin, who from 1968 onwards lived and worked alone in the deserts of New Mexico, but meanwhile continued to exhibit internationally. Henry, I can't see the slides. I don't know why that is.
I haven't put them up yet, but I can put them up now if you're ready.
Okay, it will help me if they're up. Brilliant. Okay, so this talk is based on a chapter from my book, Contemporary Artists Working Outside the City, Creative Retreat, which came out in 2018. The book explores ways in which contemporary artists in Western Europe and America established homesteads in remote locations, while at the same time maintaining a relationship with the major artwork centres and the networks of colleagues, curators, critics and collectors found in those places. I think we might be a little bit out of sync. Okay, so that's the cover of the book that I just mentioned. And then if we can go on to the third slide. Thank you, that's perfect. The title of this talk, We Are Born as Nouns, Not Verbs, is a quotation from the writings of Agnes Martin, which is suggestive of many of the most interesting aspects of her life and work. Martin believed that people were born with certain potential that was specific to each individual, but that this potential would only be realized through what she called positive actions. She said in a 1979 conversation with her gallerist and longtime friend, Arnie Glincher, "I want to be myself and have a true life, and only then can I unfold." Agnes Martin's self-actualization unfolded through 3 distinct developmental phases: the years of early experimentation between 1940 and 1960, her time of making grid paintings in New York between 1960 and 1967, and finally a third phase, which began in 1974 When following her first major retrospective and aged 63, Agnes Martin took up painting again in New Mexico and turned to composition with stripes and a wider range of colours. The project of reading Martin's life is one that's bound up with many decisions about how to respond to what her biographer Nancy Princenthal calls lacunae in the record. For some, any detailed discussion either of Martin's schizophrenia or her queerness are invasive and disrespectful to the memory of the dead artist who can no longer speak for herself. My own approach is one that considers Agnes Martin's life and work as being necessarily interwoven and seeks to productively historicize the artist's work. Agnes Martin's work also presents a particular interpretive challenge to the critic and art historian. Her paintings and drawings are notoriously difficult to reproduce. As with live performance, you have to be there, and the adjectives most commonly used to describe her work include ineffable, evasive, inexplicable, enigmatic, mysterious, mystical, mythical, and unknowable. In reading the excellent literature on Agnes Martin, or what Rosalind Krauss called the exceedingly superficial and repetitive literature on Agnes Martin, one frequently encounters a reading of her work as minimal and influenced by Taoist and Zen thought, and an interpretation of the artist as sage-like. Reviews and critical texts relating to Martin that allude to the religious include the words and phrases prayer, sacred, sublime, meditative, contemplative, aesthetic, monastic, monkish, art nun, and apostle of retreat. Elsewhere, Martin's been described as a high priestess of minimal painting and a saint or other sacred person, and as one review asserted famously, her art has the quality of a religious utterance, almost a form of prayer. Therefore, this talk aims to do two things: to examine what Suzanne Hudson has called the reverential biography and truism verging on cliché that surrounds Agnes Martin, and to develop a more accurate and balanced account of the artist and her work. Agnes Martin led a peripatetic early life. She was born in 1912 in the small Canadian prairie town of Macklin to a family of Presbyterian wheat farmers of Scottish extraction who had originally hailed from the Isle of Skye. Agnes Martin's father either died or left the family when she was 2, after which her mother carried on running the family farm for the next 3 years. By 1917, Margaret Martin had tired of the demands of rural life, and in the next few years she moved with her 4 children east to the town of Lumsden and then on to Calgary before moving again in 1919 when Agnes Martin was age 7, this time to live in Vancouver, where she bought, renovated, and sold houses to make a living, which I should say was quite an unusual thing to do at the time. The migration of the Martin family from the countryside to the city was a path that reflected the general pattern of population growth and change from the mid-1800s onwards, as the new cities threw into stark contrast the frustration of unending toil and the isolation of country life, and thousands left farms for cities in search of opportunity and personal freedom. The Great Crash of 1929 heralded another seismic shift in North American society and culture, and the radically changed economic climate now prompted Agnes Martin to move once more. In 1931, aged 19, she left her family home in Vancouver for Washington in the United States, believing there would be greater opportunities available to her there. She studied at Western Washington College of Education, which enabled her to teach, a profession that she would follow for the next 20 or more years, teaching at various stages and in different settings. However, during the years of the Depression, teaching positions were hard to secure, and it's known that while Martin worked as a teacher, she also worked at different times with mining and logging companies, and as a driver, a tennis coach, a waitress, a baker's helper, a dishwasher, an elevator attendant, and a dorm monitor. Martin herself displayed typical stoicism when describing these years of hardship, joking, "Whenever I was really starving, I washed dishes because then I got closer to the food." In 1941, Martin moved to New York and studied for a BA at Teachers College, Columbia University, graduating at the age of 30, which was when she decided to become an artist. However, Martin's financial circumstances meant she still had to combine teaching with painting, and she spent a further 3 years in this way before in 1946 she decided to move again. This time, Martin moved far afield to the desert plains of Taos, New Mexico, where she first studied art and then afterwards taught art at the University of New Mexico at Albuquerque and Taos. Agnes Martin was used to living in rural places, and photographs taken of the artist in New Mexico during the late 1940s show her looking at ease outdoors, whether on horseback or painting the local landscapes. Martin spent the next decade in New Mexico studying, teaching, and painting the vast open vistas, canyons, and mountains of the desert landscape of New Mexico. Besides its physical beauty, New Mexico was also important for the people that it attracted. Since the late 19th century, Taos had been a haven for those seeking an escape from urban industrialization, frequented by white settlers, including rich socialites, writers and artists, cowboys, prospectors, and desperados. Artists such as Marsden Hartley, Edward Hopper, and writers D.H. Lawrence and Willa Cather had visited, drawn by the churches, pyramids, and natural beauty of the surrounding landscape, but also, crucially, I think, by the hospitable salons of art patrons, 3 of which most notable were Mabel Dodge Lewin, Helene Wurlitzer, and Millicent Rogers, who all lived there and all invited people to come and stay with them. In 1946, when Martin first arrived, Taos was the home of artists including Georgia O'Keeffe, Spud Johnson, Andrew Daysburg, and the nature photographer Elliot Porter. American painter Georgia O'Keeffe was perhaps the most notable local artist living in New Mexico in the post-war period. Indeed, it could be said that O'Keeffe offered a model to other artists, including Agnes Martin, of how to live and work in isolation in New Mexico, yet remain connected to the New York art world. Since her first trip to New Mexico in 1929, O'Keeffe had traveled west every year, leaving the New York art world to spend up to 6 months painting the New Mexico churches, rock formations, and desert landscapes in relative solitude before returning to New York to exhibit her works in husband Alfred Stieglitz's gallery. 3 of the most prominent women visitors to Taos, Mabel Dodge, Georgia O'Keeffe, and New York gallerist Betty Parsons, also had relationships with women in Taos, and it's been speculated that Agnes Martin also formed some same-sex relationships in the town, where single women were not uncommon, where homosexuality was more acceptable than elsewhere, and where independent spirits were welcome. During her first 10 years in New Mexico, Agnes Martin was still struggling to articulate her own artistic vision as she produced first portraits and landscapes rendered variously in encaustic, watercolor, and oil paint. Martin then began producing abstract biomorphic paintings such as Midwinter, 1954, rendered with oil on canvas. Very few of the paintings from these early years survive, as Martin later considered them unsuccessful and reclaimed as many as she could for the purpose of destroying them. In 1954, Agnes Martin met the New York gallerist Betty Parsons for the first time in Taos. Parsons admired Martin's recent works like Autumn Watch, a moody, semi-abstract oil on canvas in shades of white, grey, and black, and urged Martin to move to New York, but lacking the funds to support herself on the East Coast, Martin demurred. 2 years later, in the summer of 1957, Martin again met Betty Parsons in Taos. The gallerist again admired Martin's raw biomorphic works and offered a representation, but only on the condition that she would move to work in Manhattan. This time, Parsons bought 5 of Martin's paintings, thus enabling Martin to accept her invitation and move back to New York that year. Agnes Martin's career as an artist began in earnest after she settled in New York in 1957, where Betty Parsons introduced her to the derelict shipping loss of Coenties Slip in Lower Manhattan. The former dock had been filled in the 1890s and was now home to a community of artists including Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, James Rosenquist, and Ellsworth Kelly. Martin lived in 3 different loft apartments in the neighborhood over the next decade, as arrangements changed and buildings were gradually demolished for development. Although Agnes Martin was, by virtue of her age, being born in the same year as Jackson Pollock, she was part of the same generation as the abstract expressionists, but in Lower Manhattan, she joined a younger community of artists seeking new paths in reaction to the work of painters such as Pollock and Rothko. As Moira Roth has noted in her essay, The Aesthetics of Indifference, the machismo attitudes proudly displayed by the abstract expressionists were now countered by the homosexuality and bisexuality permissible and even common amongst the new aesthetic group. Martin formed close relationships with neighbours including textile artist Anne Wilson and Lenore Tawney, whose work we can see on the screen now. With Tawney, she formed an intimate relationship that lasted for several years. Another significant friend was painter Ellsworth Kelly, who was similarly engaged on a quest to realise abstract art through painting, although in a very different style from Martin. Kelly later wrote, "I think that if you can turn off the mind and look only with the eyes, ultimately everything becomes abstract." As Kelly recalled, he and Martin shared a love of the anonymous, of doing the work. The work itself is what is important. We don't want our personality in the art. Another very significant presence in Martin's life in New York was Ad Reinhardt, who became an important friend and supporter, interested, like her, in education and ideas of simplicity in art. Yves Allenbois, in his important book, Painting as Model, hypothesized that the emphasis on impersonalizing and anonymizing the artistic gesture found in the work of Kelly, Reinhardt, and to some extent Martin, could be considered as a process of non-compositionality, encompassing various methods such as the utilization of ready-made forms in lieu of invented ones, the deployment of chance procedures rather than intuitive composition, the reduction of color to monochrome, the application of grids to systematize and unify painterly imagery, and the use of serialization in which uniform elements are added to one another rather than balanced optically. Certainly, Agnes Martin would explore all of these approaches during her years in New York, as she firstly made painting assemblages from found materials, removed yellow and brown from her palette in favor of shades of white and gray and blue, and adopted a formal vocabulary of making grid paintings using serialized motifs, tiny dashes and dots, repeated thousands of times. As the 1950s drew to a close, Martin's work was undergoing a marked evolution as she reacted to conversations with artist friends such as Ellsworth Kelly, Barnett Newman, and Ad Reinhardt. Reinhardt had heard D.T. Suzuki lecture at Columbia University and had subsequently incorporated Zen practice and language into his reductionist approach towards painting. Reinhardt had begun to articulate his vision for reductive, purified art that challenged the very limits of apprehension in the late 50s, which became fully articulated in a series of black paintings produced after 1960. As Lucy Lippard later noted in an essay entitled The Silent Art, Reinhardt was the major American precedent for the monotonal art that would prove so significant in the New York art world of the 60s and 70s. At first sight, Reinhardt's 5-foot square, black, ultimate or final paintings appear to be completely black, but after the viewer starts to invest time in closely scrutinizing the paintings, perhaps stepping back and moving from side to side, they begin to reveal different shades of black arranged in geometric shapes within the confines of the canvas. Black that contains grey, black with a hint of purple, black that is also very faintly tinged with dark green. The experience of immersion offered to the viewer by Reinhardt's final paintings hides his intense effort and turns the contingent particulars of his making process into evanescent universal experience, a path that Agnes Martin was now following, albeit in her own way that focused not on darkness and finality, but more upon translucency and transcendence. Sometime between the late 1950s and the early 1960s, Agnes Martin made her breakthrough, arriving at what she considered to be her true function as an artist, when she began to produce the grid paintings that she felt represented her inner vision. In an interview in 1989, she related, "Well, when I first made a grid, I happened to be thinking about the innocence of trees. And then this grid came into my mind and I thought it represented innocence. and I still do. So I painted it, and then I was satisfied. The painting that Martin is referring to is The Tree from 1964. But from 1960 onwards, she was making works in what would become her signature format, 6-foot square painted canvases such as White Flower, in which Martin's growing interest in how to represent the consoling feeling of infinity began to find concrete expression through a striking combination of a ground of grey-brown oil paint overlaid with a grid of horizontal rectangles rendered in thin white lines. Within each rectangle, Martin painstakingly inscribed a pair of 2 white dashes, generating an incremental bloom, a field of petals. Following White Flower, Martin made 2 more paintings, The Islands and Starlight, both of which featured thousands of tiny white motifs, meticulously inscribed in oil paint against a brown background, a combination that was all the more striking as both oil paint and the colour brown subsequently disappeared from her paintings. In the next few years, Martin would produce many translucent paintings such as The Tree, Morning, and Grass, which were precise up close and glowed from a distance. But in making these later works, the only paint she used was white acrylic, and each canvas was covered from edge to edge with a meticulously painted grid. Suzanne Hudson interprets Martin's shift from using oil to acrylic paint in 1964 as evidence of the artist's drive towards removing as many traces of her process and personality from the work as possible, as she strove towards an art that would exist beyond her. Zoe Leonard has written that the spectator looking at an Agnes Martin painting is looking simultaneously at a painting and a process, and ponders whether some way of thinking that happens through prolonged stretches of skilled, repetitive manual labour, such as sewing, quilting, or drawing lines, is then transmitted to the viewer of that work as an effect. She asked, how long does she sit there? How many marks does she make? It is many gestures, many small gestures, an accumulation of gestures into an experience. Does that looking, her looking, unfurl into my looking? The human variation in Martin's hand-drawn lines, as Kasia Linville pointed out, results in the artist's touch judgments being both tangible and visible on the surfaces of the paintings, giving variation to and charging each grid with a tremor. Many years later, Bryony Fair echoed Linville's interpretation in her own analysis of Martin's work, writing, outside the realm of perspective, the fugitive line becomes that which constructs and escapes the system. However, other art historians such as Douglas Crimp have argued the reverse, that Martin's painstakingly meticulous approach served to anonymize her grids. These kind of discussions around personality and how it does or doesn't manifest itself in Agnes Martin's art lie at the heart of existing scholarship on the artist. One of the most thoughtful considerations of issues of selfhood and authorship in relationship to Agnes Martin comes from Jala Mansour in their essay, which links together Martin's close study of the ethical poetics of subjectivity and the evolving conditions of her artistic practice. They write, she's grappled with the issue of how to be ethically in the world for most of her career, experimenting with Eastern philosophies from Confucianism to Zen Buddhism, as well as disciplinary Western religions such as strict Presbyterianism, in order to arrive at a model of humility and subjectivity critical of the primacy of the self. Martin's explorations into a viable mode of selfhood wove their way into the very conditions of her artistic practice. Part of a consideration of the selfhood of Agnes Martin must take account of her description by others as lesbian or queer, even though Martin herself did not categorize herself using any of those terms. However, for most of her life, she lived in a climate of homophobia. Homosexuality was classified as an illness until 1973 and was not legalized across America until 2003, when Martin was 91 and just a year away from her death. It's impossible to know whether Agnes Martin would have been more open about her sexuality had she lived in a more tolerant era, but it's possible. Since Martin's death, the discourse surrounding homosexuality has developed into a significant body of queer theory, and accordingly, the silence which surrounded Agnes Martin's sexuality during her lifetime has now been breached by various commentators seeking to out the artist. Recent publications on Martin by Arnie Glincher, Nancy Princenthal, Tiffany Bell, and Frances Morris have all acknowledged Martin's relationships with other women during her years living and working in New York with artist Lenore Tawney and with the Greek-born sculptor Chrysa. Agnes Martin was an intensely private person who forbade her friends and colleagues from discussing the details of her life with critics and journalists. Since Martin's death in 2004, some material relating to her schizophrenia has appeared for the first time, notably in her gallerist and friend Arnie Glincher's 2012 book, Agnes Martin, which provided the first significant discussion of Martin's mental illness. In her 2015 biography, Nancy Princenthal writes, "If it's hard to reconcile conflicting aspects of Martin's work and character, it's because her internal life was deeply fragmented. By adulthood, she had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. She was hospitalized several times and treated for the illness with both talk therapy and medication throughout much of her life. As is often the case with schizophrenia, Martin was subject to auditory hallucinations and images that came to her through inspiration. She heard and saw things that others didn't. When Martin was aged around 39 or 40, the first documented schizophrenic episode appears in her biographical record. The episode occurred in late 1961 or early 1962, when she was found wandering the streets of New York in a catatonic state and hospitalized for most of 1962. During this long period of ill health and recuperation in 1962, Lenore Tawney gave titles to several works by Agnes Martin that were due to be exhibited, as Martin was not well enough to do this herself. Martin said, "I had one show when I was ill, and Lenore put it on and she named the drawings. But apart from that one really small and slightly tangential allusion, Martin did not ever discuss her illness in public." Martin's next serious schizophrenic episode occurred in 1965 when she was aged 53, while she was undertaking a trip by freighter to India, which resulted in Lenore Tawney traveling to India to bring her home again for treatment. Despite enduring fluctuating mental health, Agnes Martin's professional standing continued to increase throughout the 1960s, and her work began to be included in exhibitions such as the 1966 Systemic Painting exhibition at Guggenheim, where her work was shown as a minimalist artist alongside Sol LeWitt, Robert Ryman, and Donald Judd. In 1966, she was also awarded a £5,000 National Endowment of the Arts grant, but that welcome news was tempered by other worse tidings that were received simultaneously. That very day, I heard they were going to tear down my loft. Agnes Martin's next documented schizophrenic episode took place in New York in 1967, which resulted in her being committed to the notorious Bellevue Hospital, pictured here, where she was physically restrained, heavily sedated, and underwent electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. Arnie Glincher recorded, "She said that she would have been allowed to leave if she could have found someone to take responsibility for her dismissal, but she called her friends and neighbours, Ellsworth Kelly, Barnett Newman, and Jack Youngerman, and they were all unreachable. Increasingly, Martin would start to believe that living in New York was contributing to her poor mental health, and she began to consider leaving the city." Martin's inclusion in 10, 1967, a group show staged at Virginia Dwan's LA Gallery alongside Sol LeWitt, Carl Andre, Donald Judd, Dan Flavin, Joe Baer, Robert Morris, Michael Steiner, Robert Smithson, and Ad Reinhardt, was another important moment that again situated Martin's work alongside minimalist artists, exploring the potential of regular forms such as cubes and grids. Martin's metaphysical subject, how space and light could be manifested through an artwork as seen by the viewer, seemed to align her with the spiritual project of the abstract expressionists, even while her formal vocabulary of grids aligned her practice with the newer aesthetic of artists such as LeWitt, Judd, Morris, and Smithson. In particular, there was an interesting correlation between the work of Martin and that of Smithson, as his investigation of ideas of sight and non-sight mapped onto Martin's exploration into using the experience of contemplating a painting to access memories of experiences in nature, what she called inspiration. The question of how to paint in such a way that could transcend her own ego to offer a consummated experience between picture and onlooker would increasingly preoccupy Martin's thoughts. As the 1960s wore on, Martin continued to find the competitive atmosphere of the New York art world increasingly stressful and became unhappy about her growing personal fame, which meant frequent interruptions and multiplying worries about the risks of pride. She later explained, "I suppose you could say I wasn't up to the demands and everything, the life I had to live there. But there was something else, that I came to a place of recognition of confusion that had to be solved. I had to have that time, and nobody's going to give you time where I was, so I had to leave." Importantly, her growing inclination to leave New York was not to do with a sense of failure, but quite the opposite. As she explained, "I had established my market, so I felt free to leave." On the 30th of August 1967, while at work in his New York studio, Ad Reinhardt died suddenly of an heart attack at the age of just 53. Martin was at that time just 2 years Reinhardt's senior, and the shock of losing her friend and mentor added to her existing concerns about the imminent demolition of her studio and her relationship with the conceptual artist Chrissa, which had ended acrimoniously. A week after Reinhardt's death, Martin went to Arnie Glincher's gallery and told him of her decision to stop painting, and she also asked him to give away her art supplies to a young artist. Using money she had saved from her NEA grant, Martin bought a white Dodge pickup truck and a caravan, and she left Manhattan to travel around aged 55. She did not paint again for the next 7 years. Martin drove around in the Pacific Northwest, Canada, and the American Southwest for 18 months before returning to New Mexico in 1968, where she secured a lifetime lease at $10 a month for 50 acres of land on the remote Portales Mesa outside Cuba, New Mexico. On the flat summit of a mountain, she built her own house out of adobe, the way that local indigenous communities had always done. Martin's house in Cuba had no telephone and no electricity or running water, but living up on the mesa, she did secure the solitude she required in order to first recover from the confusion that had engulfed her in New York and in time to focus again on her work. In New Mexico, Martin found a place that seemed very far removed from the pollution, noise, hectic pace, and consumerism of city life and the threat of real estate developers. The local indigenous culture was characterized by traditional processes that respected the natural landscape, such as small-scale cultivation of fruit and vegetables, adobe construction techniques, and the use of natural materials in the famed woven textiles and sand painting of the Navajo region. Throughout her post-1968 years in New Mexico, Agnes Martin lived close to the Navajo Nation, which today is still the largest land area retained by Indigenous people in the United States, covering 27,000 square miles. Martin did not make reference in any published interviews or her own text to the teachings or customs of the Navajo. However, it seems unlikely that she did not absorb at least some local influences, as in total she spent 46 years living and working in New Mexico. Certainly, the Navajo worldview has much in common with the ideas that Martin engaged with closely in the years after 1968, when she settled there, notably her insistence that inspiration is pervasive but not a power. It's a peaceful thing. It is a consolation, even to plants and animals. Martin's approach to her recovery was also guided by her readings of Taoist and Zen literature, which she had first encountered in New York, that advised that rather than looking or listening to others, one should be guided by one's own mind and soul. After moving back to New Mexico, Agnes Martin lived a mostly solitary and celibate life, albeit one interspersed with visitors and travel. In New Mexico, Martin also embraced a new expression of gender and sexuality, in which she no longer identified as a woman or entered into sexual relationships with others. From 1974 onwards, she began making a new body of works in which an expanded range of colours and horizontal line played a central part, in marked contrast to the restricted hues and grid formulations of her 1960 to 1967 works. New Mexico provided a context in which Agnes Martin could experience greater personal freedom, and the sense of expansion was then also transmitted through her work. It could even be argued that Martin beckoned her audience towards their own transformations. As she wrote, artists try to maintain an atmosphere of freedom in order to represent the perfection of those moments, and others searching for the meaning of art respond by recalling their own free moments. Martin herself commented that a major motivation in settling in New Mexico was to find a place of calm, later explaining, "What we want is peace and quiet, and uninterrupted time to do work." In the first 6 years that she was based in Cuba, Martin did not produce any new paintings, but she gave great thought to her position as an artist. She also adopted a daily routine in those early years of her return to New Mexico, which involved many of the self-care strategies that are still advised for those suffering from poor mental health, using mindfulness or meditation, having a routine, avoiding pressure, relaxing, avoiding too much stimulation and social contact, keeping a journal, and having a goal or a future orientation. After 1973, all of this work that Agnes Martin did on kind of repairing her sense of being so unsettled started to find fruition in the writings that she began to disseminate widely from 73 onwards, and in the 1973 print portfolio, On a Clear Day, that marked her return to making art. She later wrote, "I suggest that people who like to be alone, who will walk alone, will perhaps be serious workers in the art field." Another memorable statement she made during this new chapter in her life was, "Solitude and freedom are the same." While it's clear that Martin lived alone because she craved peace in which to work uninterrupted, she also had a need both to communicate with others, both in person and in telephone calls, letters, and her published writings, and to send her work out into the world. Once a body of work was complete, she felt a strong imperative to exhibit the drawings and paintings, stating, "The value of art is in the observer." In order to maintain her relationship with an art audience, Martin took pains to keep up friendships and conversations with artists, critics, and collectors back in New York, even during the years when she was not making art. Despite between 1968 and 1977 electing to live in such an isolated spot where she was 6 miles away from her nearest neighbour, Martin never abandoned society and her connections to the art world, and her visitors after she moved back to New Mexico included young curator Douglas Crimp and the writer Jill Johnson, and from 1974 onwards, Arnie Glincher of Pace Gallery, who became her gallerist for the rest of her life and eventually her close friend. As Christina Bryan Rosenberger points out, the active flow of information and ideas between New York and New Mexico provided a rich ferment for Martin's artistic growth, in contrast to the model of rupture, which has characterized many accounts of her movements between the two locations. One of the first visitors that Martin had after settling again in New Mexico was Douglas Crimp, who traveled there in 1970. Crimp was then working in a junior position at the Guggenheim, where he had been beguiled by a Martin painting held in their permanent collection, White Flower, from 1960. Crimp came to New Mexico to try to enlist Agnes Martin's help in putting together his first curatorial venture, an exhibition which had the distinction of being the first non-commercial exhibition of her work. Crimp's exhibition of Martin's work, which was staged in 1971 at the Visual Arts Gallery in New York, proved to be an important one, not only because it represented Martin's early works, including Milk River, Flower in the Wind, Red Bird, The Beach, The Lake, and Tundra from 1967 to a New York art audience, but also because the exhibition made a deep impression on art critic Kasia Linville, who wrote a very influential appreciation which was published in Art Forum in June 1971. Linville was the first critic to focus on describing the way in which Martin's work takes on different qualities according to how close or far away the viewer is in relationship to the canvas. She wrote, "Miss Martin's canvases from 60 to 67 are sequences of illusions of textures that change as viewing distance changes. In most cases, they blend finally into a single tone, a beautiful grey or grey-white that still carries the emotive impact of the lines which have by this time almost disappeared from sight. Linville's description centred upon the importance of the viewer in relationship to full realisation of the work, and concluded with a description of her experience of viewing the painting Tundra, believed to be one of the last paintings that Martin completed before leaving New York and beginning her 7-year hiatus from painting. Linville wrote that something very peculiar happens as you move back from the canvas. Because the horizontally brushed greyish wash on the surface stops near but not against the lines, they seem to have halos around them. These halos actually swallow the lines at middle distance, leaving only their white ghosts. Even the ghosts disappear eventually. Ideas about the relationship between the spectator and the artwork were finding new currency in the early 1970s as new art forms developed that were predicated on the participation of the audience, notably minimalist, conceptual, performance, and earth art. The renewal of interest in Agnes Martin's pre-1968 works was further strengthened as several paintings from that period were also on display in Europe and America in major survey exhibitions, including The Art of the Real, 1969, White on White, 1971, and Harold Seaman's highly influential Documenta 5 in 1972. In 1972, after Martin had been living in New Mexico for 5 years, she was invited to the Domberger Print Workshop in Stuttgart, where she produced a portfolio of 30 screen prints entitled On a Clear Day, which were published by Parasol Press and exhibited in Paris and New York the following year, which was also when her first large-scale career retrospective took place at the Institute of Contemporary Art at the University of Pennsylvania. The exhibition included paintings and drawings made during Martin's decade in New York, and the catalogue included some of her writings, which Martin had begun composing in New York and then resumed writing after she'd resettled in New Mexico. In one text, Martin explained in one of her most quoted statements, "My paintings are lightness, about merging, about formlessness, breaking down form. You wouldn't think of form by the ocean. You can go in if you don't encounter anything. A world without objects, without interruption, making a work without interruption or obstacle. It is to accept the necessity of the simple direct going into a field of vision as you would cross an empty beach to look at the ocean." From 1971 onwards, Martin then began delivering her poetic prose texts about art and life as public lecture to coincide with her many exhibitions in Europe and America. And after 1973, her writings began to appear in the pages of art magazines and catalogues. As exhibitions of Martin's work were not frequent and reproductions of her paintings and drawings bore little relation to her works as seen in person, her writings quickly acquired great significance for those who sought greater insight into the practice of this highly committed and reclusive artist. In 1974, together with the architect Bill Katz, Martin built a new one-room house on the Mesa in Cuba, which she then used as both her sleeping space and her studio. This work-live space was made of logs with adobe insulation and simply furnished with an old sewing machine mounted on cast iron legs, a simple 1940s boys' room oak bed and matching chest, and 2 oak captain's chairs to view the paintings. In this room with a sloping ceiling, which measured roughly 35 by 35 feet, where she lived without hot water and using a wood-burning stove for heat and cooking, Martin began to paint again, producing many beautiful paintings and drawings. In June 1974, she visited Pace Gallery in New York to ask if they would be interested in representing her. On receiving a positive answer in September 1974, she invited Fred Mueller and Arnie Glincher to come and see her new work. Glincher noted that, unlike the home where she'd lived for her first 6 years in Cuba, Martin's new accommodation had been wired for electricity by the artist and her brother Ronald. However, Martin had not deviated from her lifelong habit of subsisting on a very simple, low-cost diet. She tells us she was isolated on the Mesa the entire winter. She preserved homegrown tomatoes and had a store of walnuts and hard cheese. Not even the decision of planning a meal was allowed to distract her from the making of her paintings. To avoid a break in concentration, she ate the same thing every day. Many commentators have remarked on Martin's extremely simple way of life, even after she began making a living from her art from the 1960s onwards. However, throughout her entire life, from childhood until adulthood, she lived in modest accommodation, usually without such conveniences as indoor plumbing or running water, and subsisting on simple homemade food that could be cooked on the top of a wood-burning stove. It's hardly surprising that Agnes Martin maintained lifelong habits of thrift. Her parsimonious attitude was shaped initially by her Calvinist religious background and by the poverty in which she mostly lived, but was then maintained by her desire to save up as much as possible so that she could escape menial labour and focus on her art. In later life, she maintained a simple lifestyle solely in order to focus on her art. Although to most people, Agnes Martin's lifestyle sounds extremely arduous, she didn't view it in that way. As Nancy Princenthal points out, Martin advocated humility, celibacy, and above all, egolessness, and she suffered fairly extreme poverty with little protest. Even when she became wealthy, she lived simply. Her discipline in all things was prodigious. The idea of discipline is a very significant one in relationship to Agnes Martin. She used it many times in interviews and her own writings. For example, in her childhood recollections of her stern mother, and in recalling her own work as a teacher and carer of children in the 1930s and 40s, stating, "I think the best work I've done is as a disciplinarian, you know. I think I inherited it from my mother. I'm just a natural." In later life, Martin's career as an artist, as Princenthal correctly notes, was driven by a combination of her strong work ethic and impressive self-mastery. In Beauty is the Mystery of Life, a lecture first given by Martin during the Carnegie International, she advised, "To progress in life, you must give up the things that you do not like. Give up doing the things you do not like to do. You must find the things you do like. You must find your way." The idea of renunciation recurs frequently in her writings, to the extent that it's been said that absence, abandonment, and renunciation are her chosen forms of self-expression. The word holiday crops up repeatedly in Martin's writings, as for example in Reflections and On the Perfection Underlying Life, and in the title of one of her late paintings, Happy Holiday, seen here. In her 1973 lecture on the perfection underlying life, Martin linked together the idea of holiday with the ideas of solitude being conducive to clarity of mind. Stated positively, independence is the most essential character trait in an artist. Although helplessness is an important state of mind, the holiday state of mind is most efficacious for artists. Free and easy wandering, it's called by the Chinese sage Chuang Tzu. It is really awareness of perfection within the mind. The use of the word holiday initially seems disingenuous in the context of Martin's lifestyle, which consisted, when she was well, of working in her studio for 8 hours at a stretch. Furthermore, in his book on Agnes Martin, Arne Glinter explains that Martin's committed approach towards working also included a habit of destroying works that she considered substandard. He wrote, "A mystique exists that Martin painted very few works, but in actuality she painted almost daily when inspired, and that was with some frequency. However, only a relatively small amount of works exist from such a long and productive life because she destroyed most of the works she produced. Probably no artist has ever been a better editor than Agnes Martin." Martin's standards were so rigorous that she often destroyed works that she felt were either unrepresentative of her mature aims as an artist, such as the biomorphic and construction works she made in the 1950s, or were flawed in their execution. For Martin, perfection was something that could only be approached through relentless discipline, which meant repainting work several times until she'd realised her intention and destroying many works that she considered flaws. In Reflections, she writes, "The bad paintings have to be painted, and to the artist, these are more valuable than those paintings later brought before the public." All of this information seems hard to square with the conventional idea of holiday. However, it's possible to break through to a different conception of the idea of holiday, which is more congruent with the known facts of Martin's life, and which actually stems from a kind of deprivation in order to experience freedom. The idea of adopting a frugal lifestyle, characterized by the renunciation of material possessions and physical pleasures in order to better focus on spiritual goals, has ancient roots in the natural aestheticism of Abrahamic and Indian religions, but has subsequently found resonance in various non-secular contexts as a practical code of ethics. Michel Foucault defines such an approach in his essay Technologies of the Self as an experimental alternative to prescribed courses of societal behaviour. He postulated that a technology of the self will permit individuals to effect by their own means or with the help of others a certain number of operations on their own bodies and souls, thoughts, conduct, and ways of being, so as to transform themselves in order to attain a certain state of happiness, purity, wisdom, perfection, or immortality. As part of his discussion of different ways one's life can be made into an object for a kind of improving knowledge, Foucault describes gymnasia, which, unlike the imaginary experience of meditation, which Martin also practiced daily, is training in a real situation, even if it has been artificially induced. He writes, there's a long tradition behind this: sexual abstinence, physical privation, and other rituals of purification. Agnes Martin, as we know, in the years after she settled in New Mexico, practiced both sexual abstinence and deprived herself of many comforts common to most, including social contact and indoor plumbing. However, she did not experience these privations as losses, rather their absence was liberating, freeing her from the trappings of social convention and the material world. In Mary Lance's documentary, Agnes Martin, With My Back to the World, Martin summarizes her thinking thus: if your mind is full of garbage, if an inspiration came, you wouldn't recognize it anyway. So you have to practice quiet, empty mind. For Agnes Martin, meditation was an important aspect of achieving the state of mind required to work, and it was a twice daily habit for the artist for at least 20 years from 1974 onwards. Although by 1997, she explained she'd evolved past the point of actively needing to set aside time for meditation, saying, I used to meditate until I learned to stop thinking. Now, nothing goes through my mind. Martin appeared to see the state of mind that she entered when painting as being akin to that of a meditative state. She explained, in meditation, it seems as though you can hear my pet dogs are barking because some members of my family have come back. So I'm just going to drink some water until they stop barking. She explained, in meditation, it seems as though you're going into another phase of consciousness. It's the same thing that's required with painting. You turn away from the materialistic response to the world and you choose something else. Martin's thinking in this regard was doubtless shaped by Zhang Chu's writings concerning the perfect man who's undisturbed by desire, attachment, fear, or regret. For Martin, her spiritual journey was shaped by her desire to transcend her own individuality and the pride that she saw as the downfall and limitation of artists. She said, artwork comes straight through a free mind, an open mind. Absolute freedom is possible. We gradually give up things that disturb us and cover our mind, and with each relinquishment, we feel better. The paintings that Agnes Martin made from 1974 onwards, although retaining the same 6-foot square dimensions as our earlier 1960s grid paintings, also differed greatly in that they were all composed of vertical or horizontal stripes in alternating white and pale pastel shades. The colours range in accent from rose to ochre to orange, the natural colours of the mesa, and from azure to turquoise to milk blue. The introduction of a wider range of colours was a marked expansion of her previous work, which had conformed more closely to the strictures of what Lucy Lippard had termed monotonal art. Martin's experiments in using only vertical or horizontal lines, as opposed to her earlier grid works, marked another very significant change. She explained to Arnie Glincher on their first visit to her studio in Cuba in 1974 that I used to paint landscapes that everybody liked and bought. And then I thought, Agnes, you've got to paint only what you like. So I eliminated landscapes, objects, curves. From then on, I painted pictures for my own reaction. The first exhibition of Martin's new works, Agnes Martin, New Paintings, at Pace Gallery in 1975, revealed her new direction to the New York art world she'd left 9 years earlier. Martin's new work bore no traces of her well-known grids, but focused entirely on vertical stripes, renders in a palette of pale blues, pinks and whites, luminously bright in comparison to the muted hues of her earlier grid paintings. In the catalogue for Martin's 1991 retrospective at the Stedelijk Museum, Marja Blom wrote, "The rose tints of paint called to mind the colour of earth in New Mexico. At times, the work evolves thoughts of Indian sand drawings which aspire to unify body and soul, and of the horizontal divisions of Navajo blankets." Agnes Martin adamantly denies, however, being influenced by the landscape, and her gallerist Arnie Glincher also urged caution amongst those who sought to conflate the artist's life in New Mexico with her art. He wrote, "The visual extravagance of space in the landscape and the quality of the light inspired her, and her life in New Mexico is inextricable from her work, and yet no literal reference found its way into her paintings. New Mexico is the locus where the art happened, but the art is not about its environs." Agnes Martin always insisted that her paintings were not abstractions from nature. Her work seeks to represent the feeling that being in nature can give, but without either intellectualizing or providing an explicit representation of a given thing, such as a rose. In 1989, she delivered a lecture entitled "Beauty is the Mystery of Life," in which she would return to the metaphor of the rose. When a beautiful rose dies, beauty does not die because it's not really in the rose. Beauty is an awareness in the mind. One of the ideas that initially seems most incongruous in Agnes Martin's writings is the statement, "My work is anti-nature," which appears in The Untroubled Mind from 1972. The statement appears inconsistent when applied to an analysis of Martin's early grid paintings, many of which are geometrically organized paintings, but have titles that reference the natural world, such as White Flower, Dark River, Starlight, and Spring, to name but a few. Such titles seem to attest to Martin's persistent engagement with the themes of the organic world, albeit in an abstract manner. However, the answer to this apparent contradiction lies in the act of recall. Recall, as Martin wrote, can be defined by what it is not. It is not what is seen. It is what is known forever in the mind. In the text What is Real from 1976, Martin writes, "Experiences recalled are generally most satisfying and enlightening than the original experience," and cites the example of Wordsworth's poem Daffodils as an example of how a memory might flash upon that inward eye that is the bliss of solitude. One of the most resonant interpretations of Agnes Martin's paintings came from the artist herself, as mentioned earlier, when she suggested that viewers of her work tried to accept the necessity of the simple direct going into a field of vision as you would cross an empty beach to look at the ocean. Martin's allusion to movement as part of going into a field of vision is one that several commentators developed subsequently. For example, Brian E. Fair, who later observed that in this statement, vision is evoked as a kind of crossing. It's not simply a matter of looking at the vista before us, but of entering into and moving across a field of vision. Indeed, the horizontal line, which became such a feature of Martin's late work, implicates the viewer in the production of the visual experience of both their work, moving backwards and forwards, both far and close. In 1992, Rosalind Krauss expanded upon the resonances of Kasia Linville's 1971 appreciation of Agnes Martin in her essay, The Cloud. She wrote, "Linville's careful phenomenological reading, in which for the first and only time, there is a description of what it is actually like to see the paintings, which she explains are sequences of illusions of textures that change as viewing distance changes. Krauss developed Linville's description into three distinct operations of looking or moments, from close to reading of the surface of the canvas, stepping back to observe the mist or atmospheric quality of the painting, stepping further back, the paintings close down, becoming completely opaque." Agnes Martin's invitation to the spectator to go into a field of vision as you would cross an empty beach to look at the ocean conjures an experience of space, freedom, and the endless play of changing light conditions that occur in nature and affect how we experience colour, as something that changes as we move and look. It could also be said that a correlation exists between the indeterminacy of Martin's identity, what could be described as her queerness, and her work as an artist, which sets out to offer the viewer an experience of freedom. The idea of identity as free-floating and not connected to an essence is one of the central concepts in queer theory, as David Halpernon explains. Queer does not designate a class of already objectified pathologies or perversions. Rather, it describes a horizon of possibility, whose precise extent and heterogeneous scope cannot, in principle, be delineated in advance. In New Mexico, Agnes Martin felt able to embrace a new expression of gender and sexuality as masculine and celibate. Having given up sexual relationships some years previously, she now also relinquished her identity as a woman. Martin's cropped hair and wearing of masculine, inverted commas, clothes was not only practical, but also an outward expression of an inner change. And she articulated that to others, that she now actively rejected her birth gender. For example, during the early 70s, Martin said in response to Jill Johnson, who'd suggested she might have a bigger reputation if she was not a woman, "I'm not a woman, and I don't care about reputations." Donald Woodman relates that soon after meeting Martin in 1971, when she was 65, I wanted to make it perfectly clear that she wanted to make it perfectly clear that I understood she was not a woman. "Are you a lady?" I asked. She replied, "No, I'm not any of those stereotypes that are placed on women." Martin held the view that the female sensibility is a conditioned response, a learned response. We can all remember the suggestions we accepted and the examples that we followed. We struggled to be finer grained, more delicate, more sensitive. We limited our thoughts and actions. The result was an appearance of insecurity and defenselessness, an absolutely sure dependence. Independence is the most necessary trait in an artist. The concept of a feminine sensibility is our greatest burden as women artists. In American author Maggie Nelson's acclaimed book, The Argonauts, she reflects perceptively on new understandings of gender that have unfolded in recent years. She writes, "Gender does share with colour a certain ontological indeterminacy. It isn't quite right to say an object is a colour, nor that the object has a colour. Context also changes it. All cats are grey, etc. Nor is colour voluntary, precisely. But none of these formulations means that the object in question is colourless. The subtlety and complexity of Nelson's phrasing reflects how far thought and discussion about gender have come since the atmosphere of repression that characterised Agnes Martin's lifetime. However, perhaps Martin's work offers a premonition or analogy of that atmosphere of greater openness, as the non-didactic quality of her paintings is what makes them beloved by diverse audiences. The experience of looking at her work is different for every viewer, but that relationship between the viewer and Martin's work is defined by the experience of regarding colour. As Kasia Linville and subsequent art historians have noted, those colours may be perceived in the eye of the beholder as either sharp, hazy, or solid. However, none of these formulations means that the object in question is colourless. Agnes Martin's resistance in her later years to being characterised as a woman can be interpreted as both political and personal, but either way, it was an act that was unusual in the late 1970s. Indeed, the term transgender to refer to those with a gender identity or gender expression that doesn't conform to their assigned birth sex was not even coined until the 1970s, and transgenderism itself was not declassified as an illness until 2012, some 8 years after Martin's death. In the contemporary era, Agnes Martin's repositioning of her gender may be read as part of her general desire to transcend definitions and boundaries, both in her life and in her work. Arnie Glincher recalls that on a studio visit he made to New Mexico in 1977, she tells us she believes intensely in a world with no hierarchical value systems. In March 1977, Arnie Glincher again visited Martin in New Mexico, and this time recorded, this time she is eating only Knox gelatin mixed with orange juice and bananas. Glincher was also concerned to discover that despite the sub-zero temperatures, Martin was sleeping in her trailer, which had a broken heater. Martin, however, did not feel this was a cause for concern and counselled Glincher about allowing external comforts to preclude interior ones, insisting, "I have absolutely no comfort now, but I don't want it. All I want is a greater awareness of reality, joy, and innocence." Despite, or perhaps because of, the privations of her living situation, Martin had produced a remarkable series of 21 new paintings composed of grey stripes. The new works had been rendered in pale washes of India ink running over a field of white gesso that holds the track of horizontal brushstrokes and tiny rivulets of drips running down the canvas. Of the 21 paintings that Martin showed Glimcher, she only considered 3 of these to be finished to her satisfaction. She recalls, "She tells us all the others require painting because some have mistakes and others she has ruined, although they all look beautiful to me." Martin's commitment to rigorously editing her work had been an integral part of her practice since the 60s, but as she grew older, the act of cutting through the thick, primed linen of her canvases with a mat knife proved too physically arduous, and she enlisted Glimcher to assist in destroying works that she judged were unsuccessful. Later that same year, despite her lifetime lease for the Mesa, Martin was served with an eviction notice. Glimcher recalled that after her landlady surveyed the improvements Martin made to the land, including constructing buildings, digging a well, and building a wind-powered generator to produce electricity, she wanted to raise Martin's $650 a year lifetime lease to $1,000 a year. He said Agnes refused to pay any increase, as the only basis for raising the rent was her improvement of the property. If she paid it, she would be aiding a deception. I remember her cheerful voice on the phone telling me they took everything, even her clothes, when she was evicted. Glimcher remembers Martin interpreted this turn of events as a sign she had been living too grandly and temporarily set up home in a small storefront studio on the outskirts of Albuquerque, a white panelled cinder block construction with strip fluorescent lighting and a grey vinyl tiled floor. In this space, she had no stove and therefore adopted the diet of bananas and coffee heated up on a 1-burner hot plate. In these harsh and unlovely environs, Martin produced 77 watercolours in the space of just 5 months, each measuring 9 inches by 9 inches, rendered in shades of pink, blue, yellow, orange, grey, and the paper's natural colour explaining the subject is joy and happiness. Martin's voices still would not allow her to own any property and instead instructed her to move to live on local photographer Donald Woodman's plot of land in Gallisto, where she would pay his monthly mortgage and pay to install electricity and the well. Woodman agreed to Martin's terms and the two set to work on various tasks: installing a well, planting an orchard, installing a submersible pump for water operated by a gasoline-powered electric generator, digging a trench for gas to power the heater, stove and refrigerator in Martin's camper, and they also began building a new studio for Martin using timber and adobe. Initially, on moving to Gallisto, Martin shared her camper with Woodman, but after a disagreement, Woodman moved into a white teepee he pitched on his land. Here, Martin continued to live very simply, side by side with Woodman. He wrote, "Agnes and I soon entered into an unspoken competition regarding who could live more simply. Even though her paintings were already commanding high prices, Agnes chose to live a Spartan lifestyle. In fact, she told me she only requested money from Glimcher as she needed it. Perhaps this was a comfort to her, a throwback to growing up on a homestead in Canada. Whatever the reason, she refused to pay for any improvements that would ease our lives, as she was very content to do without. She had heat, a gas stove, an oven, and a refrigerator in the camper, but no running water, toilet, or electricity." Again, Martin seemed to only thrive upon the upheavals of the move and continued to work productively on her new grey striped paintings, varying the tonal range between white and black. Martin's move to Gallisto also coincided with her retrospective at Hayward Gallery in London in 1977, which then travelled to the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. In addition to Martin's growing international profile, as her work was exhibited in galleries and museums in Europe and America, her new residence in Gallisto also meant greatly increased proximity to other people, including Richard Tuttle and his wife, who became close friends. Martin continued to balance her need both for quiet and for company. She had never advocated total isolation, but instead the benefit of being able to secure times of solitude. The absolute trick in life is to have rest. It was here while living in her camper and painting in a self-made studio in Gallieston that Martin produced The Islands, a group of 12 white paintings in acrylic and graphite, the first group of paintings that she produced, which she considered as a single work of art. She explained, "I took myself completely out of these paintings and let them happen, and they were made with the most economic of means, almost no colour, almost no line." For Martin, the question of how to keep her own personal identity out of her work was connected to her ongoing struggle with resisting pride, which she saw as being antithetical to the creative process. She had told interviewer John Gruen in 1976 that pride practices all kinds of deceit. It is very, very tricky. To recognize and overcome fear and pride in order to have freedom of mind is a long process. In 1980, Agnes Martin received an invitation to mount a retrospective of her work at the Whitney Museum in New York, but she could not agree to director Tom Armstrong's plan to commission essays for a catalogue to accompany the exhibition. When Armstrong insisted they couldn't present an exhibition without a catalogue, Martin cancelled the exhibition. She wrote him a letter of explanation in which she stated her belief that fame, the idea of achievement, and artists taking credit for inspiration were not real. She wrote, "Only the response is real. The work is preserved because of the response. If the response is one of greater awareness of beauty and reality, the work will be very carefully preserved." This quotation is interesting because it distills Martin's belief in her audience as being both sensitive and receptive, and articulates their role as the final repository for the fulfillment of her artistic achievement. This idea contains an echo of Mark Rothko's 1947 statement, "A picture lives by companionship, expanding and quickening in the eyes of the sensitive observer." In 1982, Martin was admitted to the state hospital in Colorado Springs after being found by police officers wandering the streets of Pueblo in a disorientated and distressed condition. After being discharged from hospital, Martin began seeing a therapist in Santa Fe, advised that she should move out of her camper and start living in a real house, which she asked Woodman to design and build for her. By summer 1983, the house was complete, and as Woodman recalled, although this house was sparsely furnished, she now had central heating, a full kitchen for the first time, and indoor plumbing, including a tub and shower. The first thing Agnes did was to place 2 high-back rocking chairs in front of the bay window where she would often sit and look out either at the pool or across the treetops that lined the creek. In her 70s, Agnes Martin began to receive a more carefully considered course of treatment for her schizophrenia, which involved new generation antipsychotic medicines and therapy. Donald Feinberg, the psychiatrist who treated Martin, observed that she has a relationship in her medicated state to the voices, where she has what you might say is an observing ego, a capacity to look at them so as not to be overwhelmed by them. Rather, they would be more like, you would say, inner thoughts. In her old age in New Mexico, Martin, for the most part, found an equilibrium between the different facets of her interior life, listening to her voices, meditating, and receiving inspiration, which allowed her to keep working. In 1993, Agnes Martin moved to a retirement community in Taos, where she lived the last 11 years of her life, continuing to paint until just before she died, aged 92. One of the most significant works of Martin's final years was the series of striped canvases in shades of taupe, pale yellow, and light blue, entitled "With My Back to the World." Arnie Glincher explained that Agnes always insisted that her work was totally non-referential to the environment in which she lived and painted. As the paintings became more opulent and complex in colour, they were often viewed as landscapes in the colours of the desert. She understood the ease with which people read horizontal lines as the horizon, but that was irrelevant. In an effort to clarify and emphasize the meaning of her paintings as exclusively referring to internal emotional states, she named her 1997 cycle "With My Back to the World." In the final years of her life, Martin reduced the dimensions of her canvases from the 6-foot square dimensions she'd favoured since the 1960s to a more manoeuvrable 5-foot square size, which was, of course, the dimensions favoured by her late friend Ad Reinhardt for his final paintings. In her last years, Martin also produced many warm-hued canvases with titles that evoke not just nature, but positive emotional states such as happiness, blessings, and the yellow, pale green, white and pink bands that comprise Gratitude. Other works produced during her final years include Love the Whole World, Little Children Playing with Love, Peace and Happiness, all titles which seem to refer to her interest in the writings of English mystic poet and painter William Blake, whose songs of innocence and experience had long been an important touchstone for Martin. She explained, Blake saw beauty in a grain of sand, he saw the whole world. When even the smaller 5-foot canvases became too difficult for Martin to move around unaided, she stopped painting, just a few months before her death in 2004. But in those last months, she produced one final cycle of works that were darker in hue and more expressive, and which she described as scary, like The Sea 2003. These stormy works were close to in tone and composition to a painting called Trumpet, 1967, seen here, believed to be the last work Martin made before leaving New York and beginning her 7-year hiatus from painting. The title of that painting is believed to derive from a passage from John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, in which a man is awakened from sleep by the sound of a trumpet heralding the Last Judgment. Bunyan's book, like the writings of Blake, had been a significant text for Martin since early childhood, when her grandfather had read these and other spiritual texts aloud to Martin and her siblings. Interestingly, Martin chose to bookend her artistic career with a final painting, untitled, which was in mood and style somewhat reminiscent of Trumpet, as Arnie Glincher recalls. I was there at the end of her life, and she said, "Go down to the studio. There are 3 paintings. Hanging on the wall is the one I want to keep. I want you to destroy the other 2. So I went down to the studio. The 2 paintings she wanted me to destroy were magnificent, absolutely perfect. The one on the wall was a very stormy painting, unlike anything that she'd made since the 60s. I certainly didn't want to destroy those 2 spectacular paintings, but I did. I sliced them to ribbons and I put them in the trash. And when I came back, she said, 'Did you do it?' I said, 'I did it.' And that was that, our last conversation." It's possible to surmise from this that in her final work, Agnes Martin decided to return both stylistically and emotionally to 1967 and to expressing a sense of the ego struggle, the personality struggle, and in some sense, the human struggle. Arnie Glincher appeared to view the work that way, observing, on first glance, in this last painting, Agnes appears to have taken a new direction. Comparing Untitled 2004 with Trumpet, it's clear it was not so much a change of style as it was coming full circle home. Home is an interesting choice of word. In 1967, when Martin painted Trumpet, she was about to lose her home, that very special sailmaker's loft at 28 South Street, overlooking the river, where she could be both solitary and with friends. In Bunyan's tale, the man awoken by the trumpet responds by saying, "I thought the day of judgment was come and that I was not ready for it." Perhaps Agnes Martin, whose life was characterized by reinvention, was also not ready. This last work may reflect her process of grappling with the finality of the next and last stage of her long life. Arnie Glincher records that although she was accepting of the end, Agnes said it was very hard to die. Agnes Martin was a survivor whose artistic career had 3 phases and who moved through as many phases of sexuality and gender, from heterosexual to lesbian to asexual, as she tried being variously a girl, a woman, and a man. From rural farmland to city life and finally out into the desert, Agnes Martin had always survived adversity and thrived on change. Perhaps then her final painting should be justly considered as an acknowledgement of just how difficult it is to let go by someone who'd been brave enough to start again over and over again. That's the end. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful. Back on there. Just shut PowerPoint. Yeah. Great. Thank you, Sarah, for that. Sorry, I just realised that my room's suddenly gone dark now.
Yeah,
I'm not really one to fall guilty.
Here too.
Yeah. if anyone has any questions for Sarah, do post them into the chat on YouTube, and I will relay them. I know there's a 30-second delay or something before anyone will see that. There was a slight pause a couple of times when I was going through the slides, and I got a bit lost in the kind of the ideas of what that scenario living so much in isolation would look like. I didn't know have you been out to New Mexico at all?
No, I really would love to go. It's been like a kind of lifelong ambition to go there. So I really want to go one day, but no, I never have. The closest I've been to San Diego, which is not a million miles away. So I sort of feel I've got some sense of what it would be like to be somewhere, as hot as that. But I haven't ever been, no, not yet. Only been there in my imagination.
And before we started, there was we said briefly about the experience of being close to her paintings.
Mm.
I wondered what's your kind of most memorable show of hers that you've seen.
Well, I think
doesn't do that much. Like they have been shown.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ones I've spent the most time with are the ones that are in the collection of Tate. So I feel like those are the ones that I've kind of had the most memorable experience with, just because I've seen them more. I think that it's really interesting. I mean, I think her works are quite democratic, and I think lots of different kinds of people really love her work, and you can always see that when you go into a gallery at Tate, if there's just one Agnes Martin painting, it will be drawing a lot of people to it. And so I can't kind of like single out one that I like the best, because I think they've all got really interesting qualities.
Yeah. Just looking on the YouTube chat, DJ Dowding says, great talk, thanks. Rosie Heim saying that was amazing. Emily Benton, thanks so much, Sarah. That was absolutely fascinating. Just M says, wow, thank you very much. Were you reading from a book that you have written?
Yeah, I was. This one. So far this book has only come out in hardback. And so I hope it will come out in paperback and be more affordable and more accessible. But at the moment, it's really great to have this opportunity to share my work with people that also, share my enthusiasm for Agnes Martin. So that's one of the great things about the Assembly House Assembly Online program, is just I love the fact it's free and that we can all get together to share our enthusiasm.
And Violet Wright sent a heart. Tracy Satchwell, very inspirational, thank you. Grey Beerful, very interesting, I learned a lot, thank you. Gordon Robinson says, hi Sarah, wonderful, thanks. Do you have a noun for Agnes?
No, because she's a verb. That's the whole point, Gordon. Yeah. So yeah, no, I think that's the thing that I love about her, is the fact that she went through all these phases of self-actualization that she lots of people, I would imagine, wouldn't have been able to. She had this amazing kind of inner resilience that enabled her to keep changing and keep moving, which I find really kind of admirable. So no, I don't have a noun for her. No.
Rosie said, wondering if you can talk a bit about her approach or not to gesture in her painting.
Sorry, can you say that again? Her approach to what?
If you could talk a bit about her approach or not to gesture in her painting.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, this is one thing that's kind of quite interesting. I think I tried to kind of touch on that a bit, that some people say that in her grid paintings, she was deliberately trying to, remove herself from the work and anonymize, the process and so on. But it's obvious, looking at her work, that they are very much the work of an individual. I think she herself felt very strongly that it was wrong for an artist to claim responsibility for the work. She said that it was wrong to claim responsibility for what she called inspiration. So she didn't see herself in a sense as being the owner of this work. I think she saw herself more as being a kind of channel for it. So I can't imagine that Agnes Martin herself would have wanted to say, oh yes, it was you know, she did have a very particular method, and if anybody hasn't seen it, I would really recommend that Mary Lance's documentary about her, because then you can actually see her making the work, which is probably better than me just trying to kind of describe it. I mean, it was interesting to me that quite a lot of the brushes that she used were quite big, almost like kind of house painting sort of brushes sometimes, but she had this very, very steady kind of hand and was very meticulous. And as I read from Arnie Glincher, if she thought the work wasn't up to par, she destroyed it, kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if that really answers the question. She didn't herself talk very much about how she made the work, but you can see her making the work in that documentary, which is a really good one. It's called With My Back to the World.
With My Back to the World.
Yeah.
But it was a nice way of her saying things weren't related to the landscape, to say.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of struggled a bit with all of these ideas, because it's interesting, because you think obviously the experience of being in that setting enabled her to feel more peaceful and to work more productively. So that is in the work in a sense, but it wasn't as literal as some people have interpreted it. And equally, the thing about her saying her work's anti-nature is kind of interesting too, until you realize that she's wanting to get people to break through to this idea of memories of nature, which you can still have even when you're not in nature, which I think is quite a lovely kind of method or kind of tool to give to people to try and encourage people to think about that. I mean, the example of Wordsworth daffodils is a really lovely one, I think, because even in the depth of winter, reading that poem, you feel spring-like in your mind.
Lovely. Mystery M says again, thank you, I've learned so much from tonight, very inspirational. Fingers crossed for the paperback.
Yeah.
Susan, Bumvin, and Andrew say inspirational talk, thank you. A few more thank yous. Oh, Gordon says, well hey, give us a verb.
Oh, Gordon!
That might be an in-joke here.
Oh, well, it has to be love, doesn't it? Love is a verb. I think that's one thing about her that I think was really important, is people like to characterize her as being a recluse, but she had lifelong and very important friendships with people. And she liked going out when she moved, especially in her sort of later years when she lived closer to other people. She liked socializing. She liked going out to restaurants. She liked having a drink. And in her will, she also endowed a swimming pool for children, local children. You know, so she was an incredibly kind and generous person who did love other people, but sometimes she needed to, you know, keep some distance from other people, which I'm sure is something that many of us can relate to.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I was really trying to write about in this book, is somewhat similarly to Derek Jarman. He liked being in London, but sometimes he had to get away to the coast. And I think it was the same with Agnes Martin. She liked going to New York, but sometimes she, you know, most of the time she felt healthier and happier when she was in New Mexico.
I liked the phrase, the holiday state of mind is the most efficacious for artists.
Yes, but her idea of a holiday was different from most of ours. But, you know, who knows? Right. Like a working holiday, isn't it? Maybe that is better, like being on a kibbutz or something.
Oh, iPad's just closed. Susan just saying, fascinating to hear Martin's thoughts about the primacy of the viewer of the painting.
Yeah.
Primacy of the viewer of each work. Fascinating concept of Martin's. Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for everyone for tuning in. I'm just going to briefly say what we have coming up over the next few weeks, just as we've actually got things confirmed. So in 2 weeks' time, we have on August 20th, we have the 3rd International Poetry Reading event with Miggy Angel, Jackie Bangkok, Obi, Andre Bagu, and Rachel Long, hosted by Kai Draper. On September the 3rd, Jonathan P. Watts is back for the next Oven By event. And this is for the Norwich Women's Film Weekend. Reclaiming the History of a Unique Feminist Event with Teresa Grimes, Jonique Vincendo, Caroline Mertz, Biddy Fisher, and Elizabeth B. Then on September the 17th, we have an event titled Echoed Structured, Structured Echo with Carl Foster, Kimberly Foster, and Victoria Mitchell. You can find out more on the Assembly House website at the usual place. I can post the link into the chat now. And if you would like to hear more and you're not on the mailing list, I'll also post the link to the mailing list in the chat. But thanks once again for everyone tuning in. Gordon said he's adding joy. Also, Karen Schiff says, love is a great choice of verb. It's also a noun. I like that your word can work either way, just as Martin was resisting being categorized in other ways, like how you were talking about gender.
Yeah, that's it.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you from us here, and thanks again to Sarah Lowndes on that wonderful reading on Agnes Martin.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody.